Right.
And I forgot to hit recording. I'm sorry we missed that introduction, Mickey. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our speaker, our presenter, Amy Pate. Amy is the Associate Director of the Teaching Innovation Center for the School of Life Sciences. She combines her passion for global culture and engaging visuals from her experiences at ASU's Thunderbird School and as an art director for Pentax Cameras. Most recently, she has been working with her team of instructional designers to review online courses, specifically virtual reality simulations, to remove images that promote stereotypes and microaggressions. She teaches scientific teaching and technology literacy. It's a tongue twister, and is co-chair of the Committee for Campus Inclusion at the Tempe campus. And take it away, Amy.
Thanks, Kenna. That's very nice. Well, thank you all for attending today. I know when I was asked to do this, this is one of my favorite things to kind of talk about and grapple with, which is the idea of what images do we include as we start teaching our students who are so diverse, and how do we use those images to connect with them and to make meaningful learning. So I'll keep it short, but what I'm going to be doing is sharing with you a framework that we developed in life sciences that I hope you can maybe take back or take some ideas with you on. So we're going to start real quick with here. So we're going to have a discussion. If you want to use the chat room, go ahead and take a look at this image. This is a pretty typical image within the STEM fields for a lab. And just quickly give some feedback to me on this image. What do you see? How could it be used in a classroom? How do you feel it would go over with your students? Something like that. Go ahead and just start chatting with each other. Yeah, so I'm seeing really quickly that there's a lot of comments about white males, usually in lab coats, and this is, and the poor teddy bears. Yeah, I'm not sure where the teddy bears come in, but this was kind of an image that I grabbed for this. It is pretty typical. This was on a standard template within one of the technologies that we use called Beyond, and it was a template for designing a lab safety training. And of course, this is what you were given when you first went in and started building from here. So instructors started with these avatars. And I think that that's kind of that unintentional, okay, you know, this is what a typical lab looks like. And so it plays to those implicit biases that we have. Thank you. So the way this started was that we decided we needed some kind of framework to start talking about images. And why did we need that? Because I think being inclusive is really hard work. So the more guidelines that we have to help us manipulate what we're going to do and how we're going to talk about things are important. And that's how we started with this. I think there's a real value to frameworks. I think it does a number of things. Again, as I mentioned, inclusion is really complicated. So if we have a framework, it helps us maybe put things into categories or things, make it a little less complicated to see how things are connected. It perhaps helps us to examine different criteria. Again, with our implicit bias, we may not be thinking about all the different criteria that we could be looking at. It helps evaluate things consistently. So the idea is that, you know, one day I might have a different mindset and see an image differently, but the next day I don't see it the same way. At least with a framework, I have some kind of consistent ways to look at things. And then in our case with life sciences, we wanted our faculty to be able to have kind of a similar vocabulary and a similar way to be able to talk about images and what they use. So frameworks kind of add value in those ways. In life sciences, this framework initially started because about 3 years ago, we were using a technology called Labster, we still are. And in our virtual reality simulations, we noticed that although our faculty developed the content and talked about the learning goals, they didn't develop the images. And so the images were being done by a vendor that was quite disconnected from ASU. So the idea was that ASU faculty knew what inclusive teaching was. They were trying to do those practices, but it was being translated in a very different way. And so once we had looked at some of those virtual reality simulations, we knew we had to set up some frameworks and guidelines to help us talk about those and ensure that they didn't come up again in simulations. So we actually developed about 8 different standards that I'm going to take you through. They're very simple, but they were the start of our framework. Again, the benefits were that this particular rubric gave a language to what the value was, and then also an image, so that faculty could look at it really quickly and gauge whether or not their image fit into this. It did also go beyond the typical gender and race diversity that we look at with images. So I think most of us are starting to become more aware that we need to show images of women as scientists, and probably move away from the typical white scientist. And so this framework just gave some ideas beyond those things. It did just focus on imagery, and that could be either in the form of a simulation, whether it's virtual reality or an actual image in your PowerPoints or on the Canvas page. But visual information is what we looked at. It was challenging because it didn't address any pedagogy. So I want to tell you that the limitations were there. It really addressed just images within souls. And I'm going to give you the link to this because I think that might be good for you to have later on. So if I can copy it real quick, let's see if I can do that. Technology, we just love it. Oh, where did my chat go? Now I don't have a chat. Oh no, I do have a chat. There we go. There we go. Okay, so that's the link to the framework that we developed, and I'm going to go through that. You don't have to open it if you don't want to, but I'm going to go through each of those, what we call values is how we added them. So we worked with the Labster team as well as faculty members and some experts in inclusion from ASU, and these were the 8 categories that we came up with. One is that we wanted to look at the language that was being used to make sure it was non-judgmental. This came up because we had a woman who in a simulation walked into a lab, and the question was, what's wrong with this woman? And we decided that's a bit judgmental. So the correct response of what the learning goals were was to get down to, why is this woman not dressed appropriately to do the work in the lab? So we had to, again, kind of think about the language we were using within simulations. We also wanted to make sure that the language was empathetic. So the idea of understanding emotions that were involved with this came up because we had a simulation, and it's pretty typical, where we're focused on the doctor making a diagnosis and you know, the technical equipment and the technical medical terms that are going on there. And we had not really taken into consideration the fact that this woman was going through a very difficult emotional choice with her child. And so the doctor's avatar was just kind of coldly going through the motions, but there was no realization that this was quite a scary topic to cover. And then of course we had the values in terms of diversity. So the first one was gender, and we talked a lot about that. Of course, that's more obvious, but we are finding it in ways that you might not think about, which is the fact that there was a drone that flew around the Labster labs, and it had a female voice. And now there's quite a bit of research talking about female voices as assistants, particularly like as we got more involved with Surrey and things like that. So things to keep in mind that way. Diversity in terms of family structure. This was, again, thinking outside of what that traditional mother, father, child type of family structure is. We wanted to make sure we showed images of single parents, grandparents, and same-sex parents, all creating a family unit. Race and ethnicity was the 5th standard that we were looking at. And of course, that became more recently, that's become at the top of all of our awareness, I think, is that we want to definitely show avatars with POC scientists and researchers, just as a more diverse community, especially appealing to our diversity of our students. We have the sixth framework is within culture. So the idea that we are going to show a respect for community traditions and elders. This came up because we had a simulation, pretty typical, where researchers are going out into the field and collecting samples. And there was very little knowledge or respect for the way the land, the sacredness of the land, or the sacredness of the indigenous peoples. And so we really wanted to make sure that when we were looking at images, again, we had a way of showing respect towards those communities. And then diversity for religion. This is something that comes up quite a lot in biology because we do have evolution courses. And we really wanted to make sure that within scientists, we also showed that scientists could have certain religions, and that was, you know, part of that diverse community that we're in. And so showing avatars with religious symbols as well. And then the final standard that we looked at was called abilities. And the idea was that, again, a lot of our simulations showed a lab where there wasn't the ability to adjust a lab table up and down to make available for wheelchair bound people. So we really wanted to make sure that, again, in the simulations that we created, there had that diversity. There was a lot of discussion even around technical tools that would have audio responses rather than visual responses. So again, we could show researchers and scientists using devices that were accessible. So that became our School of Life Sciences image rubric, and we used it evaluating a number of our virtual reality simulations, but it did branch out quite a bit. What was nice is those of you that are familiar with the Peralta rubric, it connects really nicely with the E5 standard for Peralta, but it just kind of goes in a little bit deeper. What we were really trying to do, though, overall, is to begin having conversations. And as we had conversations about these images and simulations, we realized there were some limitations to the rubric, but the idea was that people were becoming more aware of what to use and what to possibly not use, and where the rubrics fell short and how we could compensate for that. So I think the rubric is continually evolving, but the conversations that were created were the real goal of what we were trying to do. So in our case, we actually do train faculty and grad students to go through this rubric, and then we have conversations that go along with that, and they discuss it. So not just right or wrong answers, but more of a dialogue that goes with it. And so now it's your turn. I'm going to show you some images, and I'm hoping that you'll chat in the discussion board or unmute yourself if you'd like to. I think Mickey will help with that, Mickey and Kenna, and talk about the image that you see based on the rubrics. So what I've done is I've given you an image, and on the left side of the screen, there's the list of the different standards, so you can kind of keep them in mind. And so for this first graphic that is here as an example, what kinds of things are you seeing?
Feel free to unmute yourselves or type in the chat.
There we go. So now we're starting to see that some folks are seeing it as, okay, so it is a power dynamic, right? Because there is kind of a superhero who's a white male, able-bodied, strong, you know, that kind of thing, as this stereotypical savior. And so that's really well done. Exactly. And so again, we're doing kind of a stereotypical. It doesn't mean that the scientist has to be strong. We should just show and be respectful to all body types, right? Great. Yeah, let's do one more. maybe two more. This is an image from one of our anatomy simulations that we use. And so again, this one's a little trickier as we start talking about the parts of a body and the images that are shown there. I think though they fall along those same lines that you're showing in your chat. Sorry, I'm reading as I'm going through the chat. Yes. So it's kind of the typical bodies, right? For a male, usually light skinned. Right. So again, we're just focusing all those images in one very narrow field. And so it's good as we teach and talk to people that we use various races and various genders as well. And then here's a third one, and I'm going to actually post this graphic in the chat room so you can see the full graphic. This was just a piece of it. So here's an infographic on obesity. And again, take a look at the standards and what you might see in terms of things that we would have a conversation around, where this may be a terrific graphic, but do we want to couch language around it before we present it to students? And good, people are commenting about judgmental fonts, which I thought that was really interesting, the epidemic. Family structures, working class. Again, we're kind of putting this mindset in that this is these are the people who are typically obese, right? And that's, again, a stereotype. Great. So that's my presentation for you. Thank you very much. And I know that we want to leave time for questions. So Ken and Mickey, how do you want to do that?
We are hoping that folks will put some questions in the chat or note in the chat that we can also, call on you or raise your hand. And as folks are doing that, I thought maybe I would get started with one question for you, Amy, which was, I was really struck by the idea of having, creating conversations around these images. Because we probably always do fall short, right? And so bringing our students into creating some conversations around this. And I was wondering if some general principle could also be used for examples that we use in class. I use a lot of examples, so I've been trying to reflect on that my examples probably come from me being, a 47-year-old white woman, right? And to think carefully, do you think we could use this around that, or?
I think conversations are interesting. So you're bringing up a couple of different points that I'd address. One is that certainly peer-to-peer is what we did in life sciences. So they were faculty talking to other instructors, other grad students at that level. But I think it's interesting that you bring up the idea of the student interaction. And to me, we also have to educate our students as to why they're going to see some of these images in our materials that aren't reflective, and how we try to avoid them, but sometimes they do come up. And that conversation, I think, could be really interesting with students, and getting them, even like the first day of class, putting some images up there and having a conversation around what they see and, their thoughts around it. Could be an incredible way to increase ideas. All right, I see lots of questions.
Yeah, would you like me to read them to you, Amy?
Sure, why don't you pick out some, Kenneth?
All right. So Michelle Saint is asking, I'd be curious to learn about what limitations you've encountered with the rubric. How is it changing through use?
Yes, so I think when we first started, we actually hadn't thought of the voices. We had thought of language in terms of written, and then the voices started playing in. So we started immediately seeing, again, female voices for the droid, females as assistants, but also the idea that there were British accents. That was the other thing that we noticed quite a bit, is that a British accent somehow seemed more intelligent. And so a lot of avatars would have, that stereotypical voice. Yeah. So it's grown from there. It's also grown in ways that again, from gender and race, we start talking about our veteran students and our students that may not have disabilities that you see, they're hidden, right? Like anxieties and things like that. So I think it's created a broader conversation for our faculty in terms of what we talk about as wanting more diverse images.
So there's a question in here, or a statement really, about how we need to pressure publishers. A lot of intro and mid-level undergrad texts do not reflect diversity in their images and artwork. And to kind of piggyback on that, I'm curious what it took for your team to change the imagery in the simulations.
So I'll start with that last question. We actually had a really good relationship with Labster, and there's some things that we were able to change. I won't say we were 100% successful, but because we had a partnership with Labster and we brought them into the conversation from the very beginning about how ASU really believes in this mission, and we want to use their simulations, so we want them to also embrace that. And so starting at the very beginning with that, and we almost had to do inclusive pedagogy training with their avatar development team in order to help them kind of understand why this was important to us. I think that's how we started with them. And then can you remind me of the other part of the question?
Just changing the
How we began to change. Yeah, our team wasn't the only one working on this. We had Sarah Burnell as well in her lab, which were really leading life sciences to move forward and make changes. So we really just supported that. And I think we now have a JEDI team that's really embraced a lot of our diversity and inclusion issues. And so we're really starting to see a lot of movement from our unit in that direction.
And then there are several questions about the use of images in texts. Somebody said that they've rejected textbooks because of the lack of diversity in imagery. Carissa asked for resources for diverse images, and some people did post. I think I grabbed 2 of those. I'll add those to the Instruction Junction site.
Great.
Let's see. Lots of conversation happening here.
I do think the publisher side of things is really important, that we, especially as instructors, if we all kind of have this mentality that we're not going to accept the books without better images, I think there is some pressure that we can do. It may be a long-term idea, but I do love it. And of course, at Souls, we're really pressuring for OER, open source products. So in that case, we can do a little manipulation with that.
There's a comment too from Katie that ASU librarian Annalie Perry provides a guide to open source images. So there's a link for that I'll make sure we put on the website. Free is the operative word, right?
And I think open source is wonderful, but they are still, again, it's free. So that's wonderful that we use that, but we also want to make sure the images are inclusive and diverse. And that takes that reflection time, and it takes time that none of us really have that extra time, and this definitely takes some time. So it has to be made a priority, I think, within your unit or within your team to really reflect on those images in classes.
Great. There's font colors, font styles, questions about that, and how can people be more aware of the font styles they choose. Somebody said that sans serif fonts are typically easier to read, so that's a good UDL strategy. So just very simple fonts with no loop-de-loos and.
Yeah, and I think that ties into that whole idea of universal design, right? UDL. And fonts are something that the rubric didn't cover, which I think is really interesting, because then I showed the graphic, and I think someone mentioned the fact that the word epidemic was quite judgmental. And again, it was that font choice. So I think we want to be, again, the rubric may not solve the problem. It opens up some conversations to have around the image and talk about what's right and what we want to show.
And then Jordan Dorney asks a question, to what extent can students be brought into this coursework, faculty student research? There may be things that different constituencies are more alert to. And that's something in the Peralta rubric too, is bringing students into these discussions. Do you have ideas around that?
Well, from the very beginning, when we started using this rubric, we wanted to bring in students and grad students. So we trained them in it and then had them go through content to really start developing that awareness and that mindset towards it. And from there, we actually hired one of the grad students to be part of our team. And she does a number of different activities, but regularly we have her working on inclusive projects and saying, hey, we need some help with these slides. We need some help with this video. Could you pull some images that would be appropriate? So yeah, I really like that idea. And then we currently, and this is a brand new initiative for life sciences, is that we have what we call a fellowship, and we're taking applications for life sciences between a faculty member and a grad student team. They're going to go through inclusive pedagogy training, and then over the summer do some changes to their courses to make them more inclusive. And that'll include images as well as accessibility and teaching. Inclusive pedagogy is what I'm thinking of.
That's awesome. And just if you want more information on that Jedi Fellowship, just reach out to me or Amy and we can share the flyer with you or more information. I think we have time for another question or two. If anyone wants to unmute or share an idea, perhaps.
And I know I see a number of my SOLS faculty here. I was expecting the really tough questions from them.
I have a question. Nice to see you, Amy and Tina. So we were talking about religious symbols. You were at one point, and using different examples within, if possible, the same picture. But there's quite a percentage of people that are non-religious. So I would think that would include a percentage of the people in the photo not wearing any religious symbol. Would you agree with that one?
I would completely agree with that, Linda. Yeah, it certainly doesn't have to be in every image that we show. We just want to kind of be aware of it and promote it if it's the right time to do that, but I certainly don't think it has to be in every single one.
And then people who are vision challenged, the sales office, they used to be DRC if you aren't familiar with their new name, but they can provide a chart of different colors that they recommend. So in our ads, we use different fonts. It's, there's a strong tendency to, I'm a designer, and so I really want to make it attractive. And I've got to fight that tendency and go to their chart and purposely use colors from that.
Yeah, I think sales is a great resource, and we're another project within life sciences is we're doing some alt text for a number of our images, and trying to learn how to write that appropriately is tricky. We've had to get their support and talk to them pretty regularly. How do you explain an image in a way that someone who can't see it really understands?
Well, all too quickly, we have come to our half-hour mark, and the chat and all the questions have really been fantastic. And so Kenna has put up some details of next Friday, same time, same place. We will have Katie Hine from School of Human Evolution and Social Change. And we're really looking forward to her Choose Your Own Adventure and course syllabi for students. Thank you so much, Amy, for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. And the recording will be posted on the Instruction Junction site later today. We'll see you all next week.
Bye-bye.